1.
Welcome to the APS Policy Committee meeting. I would like to call the meeting to order. Dr. Albright, may I have a roll call, please?
Yolanda Montoya Cordova. Peggy Mula Aragon.
Here.
Barbara Peterson.
Here.
Crystal Tapia Romero. Josefina Dominguez.
Here.
Courtney Jackson.
Here.
Danielle Gonzalez.
Here. Policy Committee meetings will be hybrid meetings with community members having a choice to attend in person at the John Milne Community Boardroom or virtually at aps.edu. Presenters will attend virtually. You may participate by attending the meeting in person, watching the live stream of upcoming meetings by clicking on the live meeting stream button on the main board page at aps.edu, emailing input, comments, and questions to board members at boarded@aps.edu, or calling 505-880-3729. Our first item for consideration and action is adoption of the January 5th, 2023 Policy Committee meeting agenda and approval of the September 6th, October 3rd, and November 7th, 2022 Policy Committee meeting minutes. Can I have a motion, please?
So move. This is Courtney.
Second, this is Barbara.
Great, thank you. Dr. Albright, may I have a roll call vote, please?
Yolanda Montoya Cordova. Peggy Mula Aragon.
Yes.
Barbara Peterson.
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero. Josefina Dominguez.
Here.
Courtney Jackson.
Yes.
Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes. Our next item for discussion is a government affairs update, and we have Dr. Joseph Escobedo and TC Reiser, government affairs team. You have the floor.
Good evening, members of the board and Madam Chair and Superintendent Elder. Tonight, we'll bring you a quick update as we gear up for the New Mexico legislative session, which starts in 2 weeks. The Legislative Education Study Committee did roll out their proposal for changes to graduation requirements. As you can see on the table we provided you, which is on page 19 of your documents, one of the biggest changes is to decrease elective units by 4 units, but requiring 2 of those units to be connected to career-connected learning. I think that's a big shift. The proposal also gives you 2 local discretion units of electives or core competency courses that you may want to require. And then finally, the units would be lowered from 24 to 22. TC?
Madam Chair, members of the board and Superintendent Elder, the Legislative Education Study Committee is also proposing making changes to the capital outlay offset. The proposal would reduce our match by 1/3, and CTE, pre-K, and security awards would not be subject to the offset. Additionally, there is discussion to raise the total number of instructional hours from 1,080 to 1,140. There is a proposal to raise the minimum salaries for all educational assistants to 25,000 and to increase the principal responsibility factor. During the session, we can expect to see proposals on improving the Family Income Index, the Attendance for Success Act, and to create an Indian Education Endowment Fund.
So, Madam Chair, members of the board and Superintendent Elder, during November, voters did pass the constitutional amendment by 70%, and that amendment will make an additional annual distribution from the Permanent School Fund for enhanced instruction for students who are at risk of failure, extending the school year, and teacher compensation. That needed congressional approval, and it actually was included in the omnibus bill that passed Congress right before the holidays. So that has been taken care of. The Educational Retirement Board did give an update. And just as a reminder, the return to work provision that we've been relying on for educational retirees over the past year or so, that actually ends in 1 year unless it's extended. So we've been talking to some legislators about that. The Public Education Department did roll out their request, which includes a focus on investments in leadership, improving academic achievement, really supporting improved attendance, and really focusing on behavioral health supports. And it's going to be an interesting session around all that funding request because there is $3.6 billion in new money, which is a record from oil and gas revenues. The PED is requesting a 4% salary increase for all staff. And then they are also proposing $56 million to help with hard to fill positions or to help us with the compaction that we're seeing amongst salary ranges. In your packets, you'll also see on page 24, this is the first budget table that we're giving you, and you're going to see many versions of this as we go through the legislature. But what you can see is the request from the Public Education Department compared to the current operating budget and how those may differ one way or the other. So we'll keep you updated on those budget scenarios, and you'll see that table get bigger as we go through the session. I'll be able to answer some questions, but I'm going to turn it over to our Chief of Schools, Dr. Chanel Segura, to weigh in on the proposed high school graduation requirements.
Thank you, Dr. Escobedo, and good evening, Madam Chair, members of the board, and Superintendent Elder. In review of the proposed graduation requirements, there are some things that I would like for us to consider that could absolutely impact how we make sure that our students are enrolled in the correct classes, that we are offering not just the bare minimum, but rigorous coursework as well, to include AP honors, dual enrollment classes in those academic areas. One thing that, or one proposed change is they are giving districts autonomy to determine what that fourth ELA credit could be. So they will be requiring English Language Arts 1, 2, and 3, but not 4 necessarily. Schools and districts can still offer English 4, but they can also offer a multitude of other literacy-based courses, such as critical reading and writing. It could be creative writing, technical writing, public speaking. So there are, those things haven't been really sorted out, but those are things that we need to consider as a district, what we want to prioritize as we are really pushing equity across our district to make sure that all of our students have equitable access to these different opportunities. Another change is the removal of the expectation for all students to have the 1 unit be equivalent to or higher than Algebra 2. So they're requiring 4 credits in mathematics still, but just including the sequence of Algebra 1 and geometry. So other math courses that may support STEM, CTE, classes can also be utilized. Again, those haven't been identified at this point. If we all heard anything loud and clear from the listening sessions, it's that financial literacy is something that is wanted and needed in the community for our students. And so that's an option that we can think about. They are maintaining the science credits of 3, which 2 need to continue to be the lab sciences, so there's no changes there. For social studies, they're adding a 0.5 credit to make it 4 credits instead of the 3.5, and that 0.5 was for the New Mexico history that they are now wanting us to include in US history and geography, which usually takes place during the junior year of high school. So one question I would have, they're requiring the US history and geography, government and economics, which is usually the 12th grade year, and then world history and geography, which is usually the 10th grade year. So it opens us up to the discussion eventually regarding what does that 4th social studies option look like in our high schools. Which is great that we have autonomy, but again, going back to equity and making sure that our kids have those options. One thing that I'm concerned with is the physical education and health. They had those separate before. And now they're combining it so that it must include content that covers both health and physical education. And our big question is, are our teachers going to then have to be duly certified? And if so, many of them are not. And so that's going to take some time and consideration from the Public Education Licensure Bureau to see how we can get that done. The electives, just like Dr. Escobedo had mentioned, electives are moving down from a requirement of 7.5 to 4 with 2 unit pathway concentration of the student's choice. And that can be in world language, fine arts, military, or CTE classes. My concern here is that many colleges and universities, including the University of New Mexico, requires 2 sequential units of language other than English for entrance. And so I want to make sure that we are setting all of our kids up for success. Not all of our kids are going to go to college, and I understand that, but some students change their mind along the way, and some students, like myself, don't realize that they want to go to college until their senior year. And so I want to make sure that as a district, we're setting our kids up for success. And so maybe we can discuss what that could look like. They're dropping the 1 credit of career cluster workplace and language other than English. They are also dropping the requirement for students to have an AP Honors dual credit or distance learning course. And they are giving 2 credits for local discretion. So what that could look like, but they must meet academic content and performance standards and can be elective units as well. So there's a lot to consider with these changes, and there is going to be much planning in place, resources, human capital, whatever that may entail, and shifts that are going to have to take place in order to do this. But also with the decrease in credits from 24 to 22, that will also impact students' ability to earn a certain number of credits each year. And so my hope is that we could look at a 6-period day versus a 7-period day. I don't want our kiddos their senior year to be leaving school early. I want them to have that robust senior experience. And so that's something else to consider. And that's all that I have, Dr. Escobedo and Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you, 3, for that overview and especially for the deep dive on the change in graduation requirements. And so just want to see if there's any questions or discussion from any of the board members on the update that we heard or that was in our packet. Board Member Jackson.
This might be a generalized question, but I mean, it kind of concerns me a little bit as well that the graduation requirements have dropped. And so I wonder what kind of leverage or leeway we have to, I mean, is this a minimum 22 and APS school board or district can say, that's great, but we'd like to keep it at 24? I mean, do we have any leverage and leeway to do that? I mean, I'm concerned if the talk has been about rigorous, high quality education and like really preparing our kids to be ready when they leave school, but we're dropping the requirements. Those 2 things don't seem to coalesce. So I guess it's an open-ended question. Can we maintain the 24 units if we so choose?
Madam Chair and Board Member Jackson, yes, this is a minimum. So the 22 units would be a minimum. And I can also provide to you and the other board members some of the research that the Legislative Education Study Committee did do to compare us to other states and why they were looking at lowering the numbers. So that might help you as we move forward.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and I think, obviously too, when we see the goals next week and, know where the strategic plan is heading, I think that that's going to also play into our ability to need what our graduation requirements are going to be. So I think Dr. Segura, you brought up a lot of very good points. And I think that they are going to, once we see what the goals are and we can kind of have that decision finalized, then we'll be able to make more decisions. But I appreciate you kind of bringing this to our attention beforehand. That was it.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from board members?
Yes.
Board Member Dominguez.
On page 20, the mention of learning time proposal. Is APS proposing this? How is this being couched? I know that the legislature is proposing this and PED. My concern is I don't want the community or parents who voted against this aligning APS with that proposal. Because I think we should allow the legislature to take the lead and be the source of that information. Is it in our legislative?
Board Member Dominguez is not in our legislative package. It's not something that we were pursued in the past. The board has allowed a local control and allowed the communities to vote. That's been the board's position in the past. I haven't heard the board suggest that they wanted to take a different stance on that.
Correct.
However, should this pass, it will be law.
Right.
Any other questions?
I do have some more questions. How will the Family Income Index help schools that do not have a 70% Title I population? Do you have information about that?
Madam Chair and Board Member Dominguez, that's really the request, is to continue the Family Income Index to actually get more research in the third year. And that's the request that they're having that they're putting on the table, and also to change. There's a requirement that 1/3 of the money needs to be spent on English language arts, one on math, and so they want to widen those requirements. So that's the changes that they're proposing, but it would really maintain the schools who are already receiving those funds.
Okay. Thank you.
Board Member Peterson.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for putting all of this information together. It's really helpful. I have been trying to do the math, and I have to confess that I haven't been successful in really parsing it out. I'm curious, when you look at the proposed increase in the per unit funding, how much of that is tied to the extended school day and their projection that that's going to be passed? And how much would it free up us to make decisions about things like class size, number of types and amounts of program supports, intervention teachers, counselors, and so on? How much leeway is there with that proposed amount?
So, Madam Chair and board members and Board Member Peterson, so if we look on page 24, the amount of money that the PED is requesting is $211 million to get all schools either from the 990 or the 1080 to a minimum of 1,140 hours. Now, there are multiple scenarios that the LFC and LESC have been thinking about how to incentivize or how to distribute that money. But this is the PED request. So we got to see what those bills come out to be. And we will be working with our budget team to say, if this $211 million came in, we're about 26%, 23 to 26% of the budget. How much would that give us, and would that give us enough funds to actually make the increase that there would be requiring in law? So that's kind of our process, and we will continue to do that.
Do you feel like there is a reference to if 4% compensation increases of 4%, Is there any attention being paid to classified employees and a larger increase in percent in funding to go along with it?
Madam Chair, board members and board member Peterson. So the discussion really has been around the $25,000 minimums for educational assistance. So that's been the big push there, and then the 4%, and then depending on how it's worded in the language that's crafted, some of those funds will also go to the additional hours that everyone will be working because of the increased instructional hours as well.
And finally, going back to the graduation requirements, I'm just curious if we have gotten any feedback from high school teachers, administrators, communities, what the feeling is. And I would really appreciate seeing that comparison that you talked about in terms of other state requirements and credits, what that could look like. What's the difference if we had a 6-hour or a 6-period day? In some ways, I mean, I know there is some indication that having less stuff with more depth is beneficial to students. So it could be that in fact, 22 required hours with a 6-period day would actually lead to increased learning, not decreased learning. But there are definitely lots of scenarios that are in, I guess, your lap, Dr. Segura, to start brainstorming, pulling people together for. But anyway, have you gotten any feedback at this point?
Board Member Peterson, Madam Chair, and members of the board, we have not at this point received any feedback because this is fairly new coming from the LESC. And so our next steps would be to be getting that feedback from high schools for each of these areas and to compile their concerns, their questions, their ideas, so that we can begin the process of what that looks like for APS.
Thank you for that. It'll be an interesting process. Thanks.
Board Member Muller-Aragon.
So a couple of questions. So have you received feedback from teachers and other staff about the possibility of that increase in hours to 1140? Have you heard from them? Do you think this is going to affect people wanting to leave just by, I mean, that's a significant increase.
Board Member Muller-Aragon, what I would say to that is we've had some emails, people curious if it was an APS measure. And usually it revolves around the fact that we've put out a number of surveys and we've allowed them to vote a number of times on this particular issue. And so they are asking us, why are you setting this up again for yet another vote? It has not been a lot, but we've definitely heard from it. And I would say that there are some people that are less interested than others in this particular proposal. I think we've seen this play out in the way the communities have voted in the past. And so we have some historical data as far as how people have considered it. But we are beginning to hear, some people that are concerned about it and the impact it will have on how we're going to do that. So that's one of the reasons we've postponed bringing the calendar forward, so as to not confuse the communities. If we bring a 1040 forward and then suddenly have to shift to an 1140 by next July, then we sort of pause until we see what the legislative body does.
And then also, I mean, we kind of know what parents think about this. So how are you, Scott, getting out to the community that this really doesn't have anything to do with us, that is going to be coming from Santa Fe, and that, I mean, they're going to have to talk to them and not necessarily to us.
Madam Chair, Board Member Muller-Aragon, interestingly enough, it's included in my message tomorrow.
Hey.
And on our website, we've actually posted, when people go looking for the calendar, there's a message there that says we're paused as we wait for the New Mexico legislature to decide on the new calendar. We certainly anticipate this. This is a hot topic across the state. This is not just an Albuquerque issue at all. There's a lot of communities that are very concerned about it. Specifically, a lot of the agricultural communities are just concerned for a lot of reasons. And a lot of the communities are on 4-day weeks are very concerned as to how they're actually going to make these days and what that means for their calendars. So this will be a topic for discussion, I believe, over the next 60-day session.
So then I know you kind of alluded to this, but you're going to wait about putting out a calendar. But do you have, tentatively what it might look like if it does increase to 1140?
It would probably be premature for me to say that. What it would include is probably, well, obviously we'd have to add days. There's simply no way, especially at the elementary level, they're sitting at about 990 in terms of hours. So that's the awkward thing when we discuss this. And I would make it hopefully clear for the public that the state defines the number of hours a student has to be in class, not the number of days. So it's done by hours.
Right.
But they're bumping up from 990 to 1140. That's a significant increase. Even for the secondary level at 1040 going to 1140, that's a significant increase. So it equates to about 10 days. In those cases, we would certainly probably look at a combination of I don't know. I mean, there'll definitely be days we'll have to reduce as much as we can inside our current calendar, I think, try to find days inside our current calendar. You've suggested some things in the past that we've certainly have on the table. There's been one of the issues that came up this year was with the initially proposed calendar is the Balloon Fiesta was very concerned about the loss of the fall break and that they would, or the movement of the fall break, and that the way they have structured their event, the kids' days were all at the back end of the week, and we were going to have to move it to the front end of the week. And they need our buses. So there's a lot of impacts that go far beyond the school system. And as we bump into those, we certainly encourage those entities to engage with their legislators and explain their concerns with the proposal.
And I don't know, Superintendent, if you have any idea, are there any school districts that you're aware of that are already at the elementary level at 1140? I mean, I've heard that there are.
I know there are districts that did move to the extended calendar. I mean, Las Cruces is doing
Right, that's one.
There are a lot of different ways to do this. Las Cruces has a very interesting, what they call the balanced calendar. They copied it from a little district named TRC. Dr. Segura has some familiarity with that. It's a calendar that goes throughout the year, so many weeks on, a few weeks off, so many weeks on, a few weeks off. It's an interesting proposal. So we'll have to bring some thoughts forward to the board as soon as we're working on it because anticipating that this is a very real possibility.
Okay, and I think the last question I have, and I think Dr. Segura just kind of spoke a little bit about it when it comes to local discretion. I mean, I guess you're kind of still giving us some local control. Will then the local discretion be totally up to each school district then? So you can decide what those units may look like, or about just allowing them just to be electives, which I think is very important to students. I'm very upset about the electives going down. So I think that's a place we can recapture not all of the electives, but we could recapture some of them.
Yes, Board Member Mueller-Aragon, Madam Chair and members of the board, they do allow for that discretion. And so some of our concerns were that by decreasing the amount of elective requirements was a direct antithesis to the work that we've been doing as a state to really promote career technical education and career pathways. And so we do and we will have that local discretion to determine as a district, we're not going to be able to do it school by school, but it will be as a district, what are our priorities and our strategic plan, I think will be, and all the input from the community will help us in navigating what that looks like for APS. So absolutely, we can have those be elective courses.
I mean, I just hope so. We need to let kids just play on their strengths and take classes that are of interest to them and excite them. And I think that's what electives do. I mean, a lot of kids go to school specifically for their electives to be in, choir or be in drama or whatever. So I think that's just something that we need to really consider. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And so I would ask if either of the two board members who are joining virtually tonight, if you do have a question or want to hop in, if you can signal it by using the raise hand feature. And I will go directly to board member Tapia Romero.
I'm trying to find it. Sorry. So mine's just a quick follow-up question to what board member Jackson and Milo Aragon said in terms of the electives, the 22 versus 24. And I know Dr. Escobedo said that we're going to look at some other districts. I would just want to ensure that the districts were comparing the 22 credit requirements, that these would be districts that have actually excelled and they're proficient. I don't want it to be apples for apples, but an actual district that is exceeding what expectations should be.
Board members and board member Tapia Romero. So the report I've actually just pulled up, it actually compares states, 15 high performing states and their requirements. Now, it's about a 30-page document, and I think it'll help dive really deep into like the definitions of what a unit is, because like, for example, Wisconsin only requires 15 units, but their definition of a unit is a lot different than ours. So we will get that to you just in momentarily.
Great, thank you. No other questions.
Great, thank you. We will move on.
Yeah. Just a quick question. I know I apologize for being late, just came from another meeting, but I guess one of my questions, it's not a question, but it's really around strategy in terms of how can the board, how can the board be, how can we be an advocate? I mean, what is it that, obviously, with board member Milo Aragon, I mean, obviously, I think with hopefully NMSBA is still going to support, local control, right? And some decision making. I think that's one of the things that we definitely would want to hold on to. And I'm hoping that that's going to be part of the platform with NMSBA, because I think for us as a board, that's really where we would like to have as much control as we have or can have for the district, so that we're also sort of in the driver's seat of like how we're going to make some of those decisions rather than them just coming down and it's just an edict, right, in terms of how it's done. So how could we be also supportive with pieces that are coming in from our parents? I really appreciate that the superintendent is going to have a message coming out tomorrow with some of these pieces, but I guess just listening from superintendent and staff, what would be some other ways that you would want the board to be supportive?
Board member Montoya Cordova, members of the board. I think you probably know the answer to that question, and it's a good way to articulate it, is that you were going to be active in this process. And I think school boards across the state, from what I've heard from superintendents, would prefer the ability to make the decision in their local community. And I think expressing that and articulating that, and when you're asked by your community what's going on, making sure that you're clear that we're simply asking if we're not opposed to the concept. I'm not opposed to it. We had a very robust conversation. Board member Gonzalez made some very pertinent, clear points, and all of you did about this, but we ended up putting it out to the community, and the community responded to that. This would change that ability to do that. And I think school boards as a rule would prefer to have the ability to make the decision themselves. So I think just being consistent in that message, if that's the will of the board. If it's not, then I think the board, then you're operating as individuals. So, but that's certainly, as far as strategy, I think that's about all we can ask of you.
Okay, thank you.
One real quick thing.
Sorry, just real quick. So I wanted to ask my question and then I'll go ahead and turn to you for the follow-up. And it's for Dr. Escobedo. So the conversations have largely been around increasing the minimum number of hours for schools from the, current 990 and 1080 to 1140. What is the conversation around hours versus instructional hours and how those hours are used to ensure that there is some quality and accountability for making sure that those hours are actually helping our kids learn?
So that's one of the details that we're waiting to really hear is, there's been a lot of concern about putting a minimum, so you can't add less than 1 hour or less than 45 minutes as an example. So definitely hear your concern on the research around that topic, and we'll be paying attention to that, and we'll bring you updates specifically on that.
And Board Member Gonzalez, just in regards to that, we were on a conversation with the state superintendents and charter schools this morning with the public education department, and a variation of that question came up. And the response was that in the past, the legislature has acted in two ways. In one instance, they defined what an instructional hour was and what counted. In another instance, they did not. So they believe that in this case, and this is conjecture because they haven't seen the actual legislation, that there will be some definition of what counts as an instructional hour and what does not.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Board Member Peterson, you had a follow-up?
Oh, I was just going to add that the NMSBA platform definitely includes districts having the autonomy to figure out the instructional hours in the day, and not just the NMSBA, but when the partners presented at the LASC, and the partners include superintendents, the principals association, the unions, the NMSBA, and they were all on that same page of saying we need to be able to figure this out at the local level.
Great, thank you. We will go ahead and move on. So thank you, Dr. Escobedo, and the rest of the government affairs team, and Dr. Segura as well. Our next item for discussion is Special Issues B, consideration for approval of revisions to Board Policy IC, Instructional School Year Calendar. And we have Ms. T.C. Reiser, Policy Analyst, as well as Dr. Chanel Segura for this one. So you have the floor.
Okay, so good evening, Chair Gonzalez, members of the board, and Superintendent Elder. Tonight, we bring before you many board policies for discussion and action, and several procedural directives for discussion. The policies and procedural directives tonight are within the area of instruction. Dr. Chanel Segura, Chief of Schools, and Joyce Gormley, Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction, as well as other members of the Cabinet, leadership, and legal are here to assist with any questions that you may have. So this first policy is on page 28 of your electronic documents. The policy IC Instructional School Year Calendar is brought for minor changes and updates to administrative and department positions. This is a discussion action item, and we will stand for your questions.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions on this one from members of the board?
I just have a quick follow up because most of my questions were answered. But I know this, we were told that this is a position that has been around, but it was just upgraded from a manager position in 2020 because of additional duties. So who was responsible for these duties previously?
Mr. Torgensen, are you here tonight to talk about that since it came from HR?
He may not have been able to get on. He may be here listening, but he may not be in a participant mode. So
the calendar committee was run through human resources prior, and it was moved because of the impact it had on scheduling, and the person it was moved to manages and supports the schedules that are done at the middle school and high school level. So the move was made over to Dr. Bowman's department, and that's where the change occurred.
Right, and that's all, written down here. I just want to know who is responsible for these duties previously. And when it was a manager position, what was the salary? Because I know the salary now is $65,851, which is higher than even our level 2 teachers. So if you could just get me that answer, who just did it before, and if you could just let me know what the previous salary was when it was a manager position, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Board Member Mueller-Aragon, just a point of clarification, that position is a 256-day
Correct.
calendar. So there is additional and an 8-hour day.
Correct.
Thank you. Board Member Jackson.
Yeah, I have a so I sat on this committee this year, and one thing that I noticed that I would like a little bit more specificity is where it says shall annually convene a committee of parents, community partners, teachers, representatives. I would like a little bit more specificity around the fact that those need to be separate entities, because what I found happened was we would meet and they would say, who's teachers? And they'd raise their hand. And then who of you are also parents? And so it was a teacher and a parent could be the same person. And I think it's very important that if we're listing them out, that we have separate groups represented on this calendar committee. I think what that will also alleviate is all of the parents that are interested in the calendar committee and don't have a say until it has already come out. So I think when we do this, the other suggestion is that maybe we do have representatives of employee groups. We should make sure that the teachers or educators that are represented are not also attached to the employer group, so that, again, you have representatives from a diverse group cross-section. And I think that needs to be very specific. And I did notice that there is a procedural directive that does go, it's called the creation of instructional school calendar, but I noticed that it was not attached to this policy. So I'm wondering if that's because of this previous discussion where we're waiting to see what the instructional calendar is actually going to look like. But that would be where I would also ask that this be brought forth again, and that specificity of those groups is really delineated. It might have the potential of making that committee a little bit bigger, but when we receive questions of why weren't teachers involved, because I did have that question, and why weren't parents involved, then we can point to this procedural directive and say the opportunity was there.
Board Member Jackson, the procedural directive is being held due to the previous conversation.
Okay, that's what I thought. And what I did notice that it under here, the policy, the procedural directive cross-reference mentions school calendar, but I think that the actual name of it is creation of instructional school calendar. So that will need to be updated in the policy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Jackson. So noting that we will make sure that change gets added when this procedural directive comes before the board once it does. With that, are there any other questions, or is there a motion for approval of IC instructional school year calendar?
I motion for approval.
I'll second.
Thank you. We had Board Member Dominguez with the motion and Board Member Peterson with the second. Dr. Albright, can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Yes.
Vicky Mueller-Aragon.
Yes.
Barbara Peterson,
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez.
Yes.
Gonzalez,
Yes.
You didn't ask for me.
and Courtney Jackson.
Yes, so long as the changes are made.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
The changes are in the procedural directive, correct? Not in the policy?
No, there's change in the policy too, because the policy procedural directive cross-reference is inaccurate.
So it's just updating that language.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we will move on to our next agenda item, which is C, consideration for approval of revisions to board policy ID school day. And we will stick with Dr. Segura and Ms. Reiser.
Okay, this item is on page 30 of your electronic document. The policy ID school day is brought for updates to administrative and department positions and references. We have had one change to the document that is in front of you. The department position of Executive Director of Instruction and Accountability has been added to this document. This is a discussion action item and we stand for questions.
Great, thank you. Is there any discussion or questions or?
So repeat that, Ms. Reiser. You said the department director is now the executive director of instruction and accountability?
No, Member Mueller-Aragon. The position Executive Director of Instruction and Accountability was accidentally marked out, and we are adding that back onto this because they do this work.
Okay, because I saw it marked out, so I was like, okay,
We're just putting it back.
Thank you. I'll move for approval.
I'll second.
Thank you. We have the motion from Board Member Mueller-Aragon, the second from Board Member Peterson. Dr. Albright, when we have a roll call vote, please.
Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Yes.
Peggy Mota-Aragon,
Yes.
Barbara Peterson,
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez.
Yes.
Courtney Jackson,
Yes.
and Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes. Our next discussion item is for the repeal and archive administrative procedural directive related to the Bell schedules. This is a discussion item only.
So Bell Schedules is on page 32, and we are suggesting that we are planning to repeal and archive the Bell Schedule procedural directive as the content no longer aligns with district practices. It's a discussion item and we stand for questions.
Any questions from the board?
I move for approval if there are no questions.
The procedural directive.
Oh,
that we
that's
do
right.
Not need to vote. So if there are no questions, we will continue to move ahead to special item D, consideration of approval to revisions to board policy IF, instructional class sizes.
This policy is on page 34 of your documents. Policy IF, instructional class size, is brought for minor changes and updates to the administrative and department positions. Again, one change, the position of Executive Director of Instruction and Accountability will remain on this document, on this item, this policy. This is a discussion action item and we stand for questions.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Reiser. Any questions or discussion from the board?
I have a question. Of
Board Member
clarification.
Dominguez, go ahead.
Associate Superintendents for Learning and for Leadership and Learning. Is that a new title for area superintendents?
No, that's always been their title. They're just often referred to as zone associates or associate, because saying associate superintendent for learning and or leadership and learning becomes quite tiresome.
Okay,
Sometimes we just call them ZAs. So
okay.
that's their official title.
Great. Any other questions? Board Member Peterson.
So I'll move for approval, but I have a request for future information in some way, shape, or form regarding class size. I know there's statutory language, and basically all this says is that we abide by statute. But there are always gray areas. Like, for instance, as we really talk seriously about increasing inclusion, how do we go about counting students? Where are the resources and how are we counting? What specificity within state statute is there that addresses class size, for instance, with inclusion classes? And this is a future discussion. I don't expect an answer right now, but I think it would be helpful as we think about this to have a better understanding of what it really means to follow state statute.
Thank you. And noted, we have a motion from Board Member Peterson. Is there a second?
I'll second. This is Josefina Dominguez.
Thank you. Dr. Albright, may we have a roll call, please?
Board Member Yolanda Cordova has her hand up.
Oh,
Okay. Yes, sorry. Board Member Montoya Cordova.
That's okay. And this is probably just for future reference to, as we're thinking about like budget preparation or the pieces that we're going, the whole section around may apply for waivers. I'm hoping that, I know I need to wrap my head around that in terms of how waivers are applied. Is it applied by individual schools and how many do we have and where is there particular zones that's impacting? I don't expect an answer for this. I think it's important in the procedural or this policy, but I just wanted to state that as a future reference.
You can answer it if you want, but
Why don't you go ahead and give us your answer and then we'll move to our vote.
we don't apply for waivers as individual schools. We apply as a district. There are no waivers currently in place.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And I think still a request for more information around how some of these things show up in the broader context of statute and otherwise. But with that, we will move to our roll call vote. Dr. Albright?
Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Yes.
Peggy Mota Aragon,
Yes.
Barbara Peterson,
Yes.
Crystal Romero,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez,
Yes.
Courtney Jackson,
Yes.
and Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes. Our next item up for discussion and action is consideration for approval of revisions to board policy IH1, treatment of religious issues. And I will turn it back over to our presenters.
This item is on page 36 of your documents. Policy IH1, treatment of religious issues, is brought for minor changes to content and updates to administrative and department positions and references. Again, we have a change. We need to leave in the executive director of accountability and reporting. We are recommending deleting bullet number 5, which was not in the original document prior to tonight. And this is a discussion action item and we stand for questions.
So it is going to be deleted because it's not deleted.
It won't be deleted in your packet, but it is deleted. It is a recommend delete in my document if you move to approve with changes.
Okay.
I guess, Ms. Reiser, I'd be interested in some more background on that. And it's included in here and it seems worthwhile to have every Albuquerque Public School employee foster respect for the educational process and environment. But why was it included and then suggesting to remove?
Dr. Segura, do you want to talk to what we talked about?
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the board, we had reviewed all of these policies, specifically with this one. There were some questions around what does that look like for every employee? And what does providing the right to the students to exercise their freedom of conscience. And so we felt like it was a little ambiguous and didn't want to put something in there that confused individuals or that was ambiguous.
Thank you for that explanation. So it does seem that's probably worth some additional discussion from members of the board if they're interested, but I will just open the floor more broadly to questions and discussions, which can include that 5th bullet as well. Any comments, Board Member Peterson?
I think the spirit of respecting students and their religious beliefs are included in the previous 4 points. From a practical level, I have real questions about what this would look like in practice in a classroom. I think it could be very problematic, and the kinds of decisions and the kinds of position that it could put teacher and other students in is definitely problematic. I mean, right now, parents definitely have the right to opt out of certain parts of the curriculum if they so choose for their student. And I think, speaking from experience, students bring who they are with them to a classroom. And so, for instance, when we talk about ethnic studies, certainly religious belief is a part of that when students talk about who they are and what they believe. But the way this is written, I think, could open up some situations that would be very difficult to deal with in a practical way in a classroom.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Board Member Jackson?
Yeah, so I guess I'm still confused. It was placed in there for a reason. So I guess I'm wondering why it was what was the, I mean, it obviously was placed in there with the best of intention. So what was that intention?
I will fill that. The comment was actually placed in there prior to this round of edits. It's a Google Doc that we've been working on for a while, and the person that put the edit in there no longer works for Albuquerque Public Schools. When I actually took the references down below and researched each one of the references, there wasn't any specific legal reference that tied to this paragraph. And in reviewing it with Dr. Segura, we felt like the content was really in the bullets up above. And this bullet was a little bit ambiguous. We couldn't answer the question of what does that look like in the classroom.
Okay, so you're saying that this fifth bullet, I'm trying to look back. Okay, so this was last reviewed in 2013. So 10-ish years ago. So you're saying that this fifth bullet was kind of added, but was never discussed. And
Yes,
so, okay. And it doesn't have any cross references as far as policy, procedural directives or legal to it?
It does not. I've reviewed all of the legal references, and it doesn't really fit with any of the legal references in this document.
Okay. I think that better addresses
So
the
why?
question as to why it was there in the first.
So I know Board Member Montoya Cordova had her hand up and put it down. Or was your question answered?
Yes, it was. Thank you.
So much like Member Peterson said, just how this really looks in a classroom is more my concern. And to make sure that whatever is taught, and I know, religious literature is from so many different religions is, quite beautiful and worth studying. And I know, and I'm certain I know it's not written in here, but whatever is taught, whatever literature is taught of religious nature would have to align to standards, correct? And I know that's not really written in here. It's just, we're just making that assumption. So I don't know if that's maybe something that maybe should be put in here. I don't know if it should be or not. It's just a thought, and you all can make that decision. The other, the concern that I have is it will obviously leave a lot up to the teacher in deciding, what religions to study, what literature to study. I mean, that's left in their hands as long as it's aligning with standards. But one of the responses, and I don't know if you want to respond to what I just said, if that's just something that you think maybe should be added.
Board Member Mueller-Aragon, Madam Chair and members of the board. I feel like absolutely everything that we're teaching should be related to the standards of our state. And so when we look at bullet number 4, I wouldn't be opposed to, and we can discuss it, adding if we have religious exhibits, music, or display of religious objects or symbols. The third bullet. The sacred literature of all faiths may be studied only for its historical, artistic, cultural, literary, or other secular importance, and must be aligned to state standards.
I mean, that's the one I wrote it into. So, that's up to the will of the board.
Right.
And then the only other, I know on my response to my questions, one of the things I had asked about was, prayer. And I know that a lot of children, they have broader ability to do that than the staff does, which is a good thing. But one of the things that was written in here, and if you could help me, is that students may partake in prayer, et cetera, as long as it's not during instructional time or where it may disrupt the educational setting. So where is that definition of disrupting the educational setting? Like, where would we find that? You know, where's that defined as it concerns this policy?
So Board Member Muller-Aragon, Madam Chair, and members of the board, there are many things that can be constituted to disrupt the educational setting. When we look at the school day, outside of the instructional time would be before school, during recess, during lunch, after school. But during the instructional time, when the teacher is engaging with students, it can become a disruption if students begin doing something, and it could be anything, not just religious, to deter the learning and the teaching from happening during the instructional time.
Okay. And why I just remember when, you know, I was teaching and there would, during the instructional day, I know during lunchtime, you had, you know, children that prayed before they ate, because that's what many of us do. And that wasn't a disruption, but then it would be a disruption, because then I did have children that would stop and say a prayer before they took a test or whatever. And so that would be considered a disruption because it's during the instructional day. Is that correct?
Board Member Muller-Aragon, Madam Chair, and members of the board, I guess subjectively, I would say no, because it's not infringing on the learning of others, or it's not infringing on the teaching from the teacher. So it's not impeding any of that. So, I mean, just I could be sitting in prayer right now and not disrupt. So yes, I know where you're coming from.
You know, that's how I would see it as a teacher, and that's how I did see it. But I just wanted to know that everybody would see it that way, as long as they're not doing something that is, you know, out loud or too loud. Is that?
Right. And that would be disruptive. If it impacts others, then it would be disruptive.
Okay, thank you.
Well, so I was just going to make an attempt to summarize that. I think based on body language and head nodding, it seems like there's pretty significant agreement to strike that bullet. But the fifth bullet that was added, every Albuquerque Public Schools employee shall foster respect. Board Member Muller-Aragon proposed to add language around alignment to standards to the third bullet. And so I just wanted to see how others feel about that.
With those two changes, I'll move for approval.
Wonderful. Board Member Peterson has moved for approval with those two changes.
I'll second, Yolanda.
And seconded by Board Member Montoya Cordova. Dr. Albright, may we have a roll call vote, please?
Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Yes.
Nikki Moura-Aragon,
Yes.
Barbara Peterson,
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez,
Yes.
Courtney Jackson,
Yes.
and Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes. Our next item for discussion is procedural directives related to revisions to administrative procedural directive, religious issues, and holiday practices. And so we touched on this a little bit already. Is there any other comment from other members of the board on this one?
I mean, the only thing I would say, I'm sure that you've all read, I know that they were going to strike the comfort of all students. So that was something that was, I don't know if you all got that, but they were going to strike that. So
That was in my notes. So the one change that we made, and this is on page 39 of your handouts. The change that we made is that number 5, let's see, changed to number 5 to ensure it was removed to ensure the comfort of all students. That line was removed.
And then the only other thing that I would just suggest, just because I just hear this from parents that have children at different schools. And so there are some schools that, you know, are able to partake in whatever activities they may decide to partake in, and then their child goes to another school and then that school doesn't. And I understand that is at the discretion of the administrator at the school. If we could just please somehow, superintendent, is just make that more clear to parents that it is up to the discretion of the administration. And I just think some parents don't realize that that's why it may be different from one school to another. So somehow if we can just get that out there, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Board Member Muller-Aragon.
Thank you. Board Member Jackson.
So quick question, because I'm super on the alert for resolutions that I haven't seen before. In this procedural directive at the bottom, it has board policy cross-reference, a board resolution 90052. Is that a resolution that we need to see? Is that something that needs to be struck? Is it no longer there?
Member Jackson, the last time I asked this question of Brenda Yeager, she did say they exist. I do not know where they're at, so I will we will need to look into that and get back to you exactly where those are. And
Yeah, if there is a board resolution related to a procedural directive, I'd like to see it, please. And we also need to know whether or not it actually does relate to this particular issue. And then second, I did notice that the policy that corresponds to this has department directors does include the executive director. Let me go back up. The executive director of instruction and accountability, but it's missing from the procedural directive. It just has school principals. So does the department director need to be executive director of instruction and accountability and school principals, or for the purposes of the procedural directive, is it just the school principals?
I believe for the procedural directive, it should just be principals. It was both for treatment of religious issues because it did also pertain to the calendar, which was in that department, but I will double check.
Great, thank you. Board Member Montoya Cordova.
And mine is just to clarify, because I think I kind of missed it. On number 5, were we striking the last part of the sentence? I just missed it. So we're striking as to ensure the comfort of students. Okay, I thought I heard that, but I just wanted to clarify it.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments on this procedural directive? All right, thank you. So we will move ahead to special issues F, consideration for approval of revisions to board policy IH3, distance learning. This is a discussion and action item, and Ms. Reiser, you have the floor.
This item is on page 41. Policy IH3 distance learning is brought to align distance learning requirements. Updates to administrative and department positions and references have been made. There is, again, a change that the executive director of instruction and accountability is on this document. Also, in the last paragraph, we are recommending, let me see, I want to read this correctly. We are recommending to delete the added statement and demonstrate academic progress for participating students equivalent or better than their peers participating in in-person learning as measured by state assessments. So deleting from the word and demonstrate all the way to the end of assessments is what we are recommending.
Great, thank you for that. Are there any questions or comments from the board?
No, I'll move for approval, and thank you for removing that wording. It was very confusing.
I'll second.
Well, I do have a question on the on removing that. So it seems important that students who are in distance learning settings do demonstrate academic progress. That feels really important. And we don't want there to be a difference between students in distance settings versus students in in-person settings. So that seems important too. And we measure them by assessments. So I guess I would want a conversation around keeping that.
So Board Member Gonzalez does the statement though, but it all says all students participating in distance learning shall be included in the assessment of achievement of all school level and district level annual goals. So, I mean, is that, I mean, I'm thinking out loud here too, because I'm like, hopefully I don't get the impression that we're not going to assess them, but I don't know, I'm not offering anything up. I'm just like, I'm trying to clarify and think in my head, because the last sentence tells me that they are participating in assessment, that they're included in assessment of achievement. So maybe if that sentence was strengthened or something.
First,
I think.
I just think it was going to be taken out. Ms. Reiser was equivalent or better, right? Because they're participating
And
Oh, okay.
as measured by state assessment. So we want that in there. The only thing is they don't have to be better. That's what was confusing, equivalent or better, but everything else they should be participating in.
I can correct that and just delete equivalent or better than their peers if that is the preference.
Yeah, because they are still going to be assessed, right? Madam Chair.
they are, I guess it is just this question of
Academic progress should be there.
why wouldn't we want them to be performing equivalent or better? But I that's my question. And I know Dr. Segura wants to get in, and that Board Member Jackson also had her hand up. So we'll go to Dr. Segura first.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I agree. This sentence is very confusing. The whole thing is one big kind of run-on sentence. But that last part, or that part that we're discussing, I'm wondering if we, just like TC said, strike I even think we take out for participating students, because that's just like, we know who we're talking about already. I think it just needs to be cleaned up a little bit and made more clear. So however we want to do that, I can do that, or we can discuss that.
Wouldn't it address the problem just simply to strike or better than, and to change that to 2? We want their progress for participating students equivalent to their peers participating in in-person learning. I think the thing that was a question was, there may be reasons why a student's opting for virtual learning, and if they're doing the same in virtual learning as they would be doing in person, then it's addressing their educational needs. What we want to guarantee is that it is not substandard, that they are getting a less than education. So if we kept equivalent and struck or better, it seems like it would address both issues.
So I believe Board Member Jackson wanted to get in, but I'm also willing to try to summarize where I think we landed, but go ahead.
Well, I was going to summarize where I thought we landed.
Go ahead.
So
We'll see if we're on the same page.
because we do have a motion and a second on the floor. So I was going to offer a friendly amendment and hopefully assess where we are. So I would offer the friendly amendment of fully align with New Mexico content standards and instructional scopes, prepare students for all graduation requirements established by the district, and demonstrate academic progress for participating students equivalent to their peers participating in in-person learning as measured by state assessments. All students participating in distance learning shall be included in the assessment of achievement of all school level and district level annual goals.
So Board Member Peterson, I think you made the motion. Are you okay with that proposed amendment? And the second was
Me, I think.
Board Member Mullen.
I'm good.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. And that was the motion from Board Member Peterson, the second from Board Member Mullen-Aragon. Dr. Albright, can we have a roll call vote? With these changes was the motion that Board Member Jackson summarized.
Did you make that aligned, ED?
I think we're ready for the roll call.
Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Yes.
Peggy Mora Aragon.
Yes.
Barbara Peterson,
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez.
Yes, but the English teacher in me is saying, please break that up.
Courtney Jackson,
Yes.
and Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes, thank you. Our next item for consideration is special issues G. Consideration for approval of revisions to board policy IH6 graduation requirements. And Ms. Reiser and Dr. Seguno, you still have the floor.
Item is on page 43. Policy IH6 graduation requirements is brought to update content, administrative and department positions. The procedural directive for this policy will not be updated until after the legislative session. Changes that were suggested, the last sentence in the first paragraph. So the last sentence in the first paragraph would read is being recommended to read Albuquerque Public Schools encourages, might need to be will encourage and provide an opportunity for all seniors to complete the free application for federal student aid for graduation to ensure all students have access to financial aid opportunities for post-secondary education. So removing the mandatory and put will provide an opportunity, encourage and provide an opportunity.
Thank you. Any questions on IH6?
This is Board Member Montoya Cordova. It just seems like it's just out of place. It seems to need to be its own paragraph because I really like I think of a policy statement as the overall mission goal, and the top is just graduation requirements shall be established in accordance with federal and state. I like that statement, period. And then move it either as its own paragraph like we have with the bilingual seal. I just didn't like it following right after that statement. It just seems odd. It was just kind of wonky to me.
Thank you. So a suggestion to make that its own paragraph. Are there other questions or comments? Board Member Peterson.
I really like the intent. My question, and maybe it will need to be answered in a future procedural directive, but I think the strength of it is that it's saying we are responsible for doing, how do we hand off students into the next stage of their life? And this is saying we definitely have an obligation to improving how we hand off students into the next stage of their life. The question I guess I have is, what does that mean for actual implementation and personnel? I mean, I know one of the things that we've struggled with is having adequate career counselors in high schools. And I think in policy, it's a great thing to have because it's saying we are prioritizing this, we need to do it. But when it comes to implementation, I think there will be an impact on high schools for making sure that that happens. And so it's just attending to making sure that we really do it and that we put the resources there so that it's successful.
To just stay on this point, I do think that having it as a graduation requirement does put pressure on the district to make sure that kids are prepared in this way, and it is not excessive pressure on the kids, on the students and the families, given the efforts to streamline the FAFSA. I do know that many states have changed state policy to require the FAFSA, and it's considered to be good practice across the board. So I guess I have some concerns with watering down the requirement to the encourage. So I'll just put that out there for further conversation. I don't know how other members of the board feel.
I mean, I was suggested because it wasn't like in other states where it is something that's a requirement. Since it's not a requirement, that was just my suggestion, just to encourage it, provide the opportunity, just because it wasn't really required like it may be in other states. But we want to encourage it. We want to make sure they have the opportunity to, that all the schools do provide that opportunity. So that's what's telling them. You have to have, like schools have a FAFSA night so the kids can come helped. So that's encouraging them. And I want to make sure that they do have that opportunity, but not say you have to do it when we don't have anything to back that up.
Yeah, I guess I was saying because it's not a state requirement, that's why we should require it to be better than the state. But I know Montoya, Board Member Montoya Cordova has her hand up.
And I think it was just kind of going back, I'm trying to remember like all the, the years on this, but there are organizations, correct, that are doing this, that are part of, I think, are they coming out of PED that are funded specifically and explicitly around FAFSA?
Out of HED.
I mean, HED, I'm sorry, I couldn't remember who was doing it, but there is, the service is available. I know that they're pretty aggressive too, because they want to be able to increase those. So I like the idea of requiring it, because I think it's a make or break for our students going into that post-secondary piece. And if they don't get that done, it could be just the lack of their ability to actually even get into that next post-secondary piece.
Thank you. Board Member Jackson, was your hand up?
It was not, but I agree. I think, we can be leaders in this instance and, help our students prepare as they leave, step out into the real world and have it as a requirement, and especially if we have community organizations that are willing to help. So I'm fine with the way it was presented in the document.
Thank you. Dr. Segura, I see your hand.
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the board, I also agree, and I think that in our strategic plan, depending on our goals that are established, this can absolutely be a strategy that we're working on as a high leverage strategy to make sure that our kids are prepared for that next level. And that goes kind of along with my emphasis on encouraging our kids or requiring our kids to take 2 units of a language other than English, because that also can prevent them from, if they change their mind in the future. So something to think about.
Can I ask one quick question? That's a real question. Is there anything in the FAFSA application that would impact students that do not have documentation? Are they protected as they fill out FAFSA? Okay. With that, I will.
She was nodding and shaking her head. I wasn't sure if she was going to get off mute. I'm sorry.
Madam Chair and Board Member Peterson, yes. So families do have to document their income, but and so that could be something that makes some families nervous, but being undocumented does not impact the student, the family, or the application process.
Thank you. I'm sorry I interrupted you, Board Member Peterson.
I was done. I appreciate that. I was just going to say I move for approval, retaining the word requirement.
And there was a suggestion to make it its own standalone paragraph.
Yes.
Do you accept that friendly amendment to your motion? Is there a second?
Yes, I'll second.
Thank you, Board Member Montoya Cordova with the second. Dr. Albright, may we have a roll call vote, please?
Can I just confirm the statement will now read Albuquerque Public Schools will require an opportunity for all seniors to complete the FAFSA?
All seniors or all students?
I think we're keeping it
Students.
as written.
Yeah, in our document.
Yeah, no changes.
Shall require.
So right now it says Albuquerque Public Schools shall require students to complete the FAFSA for graduation.
About the changes, it said seniors, right? So we want it to go back to all students.
Right.
As it is.
Yeah. Keep it as is.
So really the only change is making it its own paragraph.
Right.
Okay, I think I have that. Thank you. Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Yes.
Imora Aragon.
Yes.
Barbara Peterson.
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez,
Yes.
Courtney Jackson.
Yes.
And Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes. We also have, as part of this policy, revisions to renaming the Administrative Procedural Directive, GED testing, to high school equivalency exam. This is just a discussion item. So is there any discussion, questions, or suggestions for this procedural directive? I am seeing head shaken, so we will move on to H. Consideration for approval to repeal and archive board policy IH6A, alternative demonstration of competency for graduating class of 2014, 2015, and 2016. This is also discussion item, discussion action. I don't know, Ms. Reiser, if you want to provide any context, or it seems pretty clear what the context is, but I will turn it over to you.
I think it's pretty clear. So this is it's a discussion action item and we stand for questions.
Great. Board Member Jackson.
I'll move for approval.
I second.
And Board Member Dominguez seconded. So may we have a roll call vote? Dr. Albright.
Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Yes.
Ymola Aragon,
Yes.
Barbara Peterson,
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez,
Yes.
Courtney Jackson,
Yes.
and Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes, and we also had on here repeal of the related procedural directive. So I'm assuming we need no discussion on that. And we'll keep us moving then to agenda item I, consideration for approval of revisions to board policy IH7, instructional credit acceptance.
Okay, this item is on page 54 of your documents. Policy IH7 instructional credit acceptance is brought for minor updates to content, administrative and department positions and references. One change, again, we are adding an executive director of instruction and accountability under department positions. And this is a discussion action item and we stand for questions.
So, Madam Chair, the only question I have, why is correspondence course providers and non-accredited institutions, why were they removed now? Or is this something that we haven't done for a while and it was just kind of updating it?
It hasn't been updated since 2013. Dr. Segura may have more information, but I do an old policy prior.
So Board Member Muller-Aragon and Madam Chair and members of the board, correspondence is yes, something that is not really a practice in place. And then the non-accredited institutions, I feel strongly that if we're going to be affording our students a New Mexico Diploma of Excellence, that we have some understanding of what that means. And when students are coming from non-accredited institutions, there's a reason why they're non-accredited, and that is a red flag. And so that was the premise.
So then in the last, almost 10 years since this has been reviewed, have the instructional credits been accepted from non-accredited institutions or have they not anyway?
Board Member Muller-Aragon, Madam Chair, and members of the board, I can't speak to that. I know that in my experience, that is not practice to accept non-accredited courses, because there have been situations where, I mean, I could have Segura's homeschooling and just have my, student register their senior year. It makes it very difficult for a district and a board to certify, and for a superintendent to certify that that is an actual Diploma of Excellence. And so I can't speak to the history of APS. I don't believe so. But that's usually not a common practice to accept non-accredited credits.
Board Member Muller-Aragon, it used to be more of an issue in Albuquerque. There was a specific school that we had to deal with, and because the policy existed, we were somewhat stuck, but it was always a discussion. That school no longer exists. I think what you're discovering is if you're non-accredited, you're going to have a very difficult time drawing students. Parents are much more discerning because now they have a wider variety of options.
And that's really not where I was going. Who I am thinking about is a lot of our refugee kids.
Right.
So
We accept credits from, so I will tell you, as a principal has served at Highland High School and certainly had that, we accepted the credits as best we could, as we could determine what they aligned to as far as meeting requirements in the state. And many times we would take those credits and apply them as elective. So for example, if they took a history of their country, many times it would be accepted as an elective. But the ability to determine the accreditation of an Afghani school would be probably beyond most of our registrars. So if they show up with transcripts, they're working with the refugee services, we made the effort to accept what we could.
and because we know, and I mean, I know, and I know you know, Superintendent, that there are many of these refugees that haven't been in a school, they've been in a camp. So they wouldn't even have really anything. It would just be you.
The only,
I don't know what it would be.
Again, the populations have changed. So for me to speak to each specific population at this point is probably not appropriate, but I do know there were students who showed up with, courses. And what it did was it gave us a sense of what grade to place them in, at least, and gave us a sense of where we could most effectively help them, because some of them came, quite frankly, some of them came with great math skills, and they may struggle with language skills. There were certain systems that had pretty strong education systems and the students attended. So it helped us in terms of placement, less than credit, because most of them were quite interested in having the opportunity to do the 4-year experience. If it was high school, for example, middle school, it was really just about placement. And elementary, it was just about grade level placement.
Okay, I'm trusting that we're doing right by those kids.
I would tell you this, that if this suddenly became an issue, that the policy was getting in the way of our placement of refugee students, we would bring it back for revision. If that was going to become a problem, that our registrars were saying, well, we can't place these kids because of this policy, I don't believe the practice will change. I believe the practice is as it is, and I think they're safe. But I assure you that if I get stories that refugee students are no longer placed because we pulled out non-accredited schools and they don't know how to place them, we'll bring it back.
When it does say not limited to,
Yes.
so it's not excluding. I guess that raised for me the question of, should we say public schools in other states and countries? Like, even if we're not talking about refugee students? So if we're accepting students from Great Britain,
Mhm.
Well, is that covered in the non-Albuquerque
directive?
public school entities?
Well, I think she's referring to
the bullet list.
the bullet where it says
bullet.
public schools in other states, and your
Countries.
suggestion is to add and countries.
I don't see any reason why we would be uncomfortable with that.
Mhm.
Okay, then I guess I would propose that change. And are there other questions or comments or a motion?
I move for approval with the change. I like that with the other countries.
I'll second. This is Peggy.
Thank you. That was Board Member Montoya Cordova moving for approval with the addition of and countries, and Board Member Muller-Aragon to second. So Dr. Albright, may we have a roll call vote, please?
Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Yes.
Peggy Muller-Aragon.
Yes.
Barbara Peterson.
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez,
Yes.
Courtney Jackson,
Yes.
and Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes. So next we have several procedural directives that are related to this policy. And so I'm just going to hand them over to you, Ms. Reiser, in a chunk. We have transcript evaluation, basis of offering credit, alternative methods of earning credit, awarding of credit or extra credit for non-academic activities. I think that's it, right? Yes. So is there anything that you wanted to say related?
Sorry. I was muted. I apologize. I was talking. This first one, transcript evaluation, is on page 57. And we do know that it is a little bit confusing when we talk about a junior high school. So this transcript evaluation procedural directive is really talking about when we evaluate a 9th grade student's credits when they were at a junior high school, which was 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And so it really outlines what where other districts have a junior high and how we accept those credits, just to kind of explain that. And so those changes have been made to make it a little bit more clear. And then I'll stand for any questions that you have.
Great, thank you. Any questions on transcript evaluation procedural directive?
I did, Madam Chair. So on the bottom, Ms. Reiser, on page 58, in number 4, it says transfer students from non-accredited schools will be ranked with a graduating class only if the final 4 semesters are completed in APS high school. And I know I would just like to have a little more discussion about that. Was there going to be a change that to 2 semesters instead of 4 semesters? That's my main question.
From non-accredited?
Board Member Mueller-Aragon, Madam Chair, and members of the board. Again, going back to when we are providing the student with a New Mexico Diploma of Excellence, and when we are including them in the cohort of students who have been in our district, to include them into a ranking or for their graduation honors, many districts require 50% or more of their experience be within that district or school. So that transfer students, for example, can't come in and bump a student who has been there out of that ranking, for example. So looking at the 4 semesters as being the minimum of 50% of their high school time to be counted in those situations.
Okay, so then can you, so one of the responses that I got had been that in practice, it has been the final 2 semesters of your senior year, excluding summer school. So then I'm hearing a little bit something different. So then the recommendation is to change to quote, enrolled in an APS high school for 2 consecutive semesters, excluding summer school. So that would align with the registrar's handbook and current practice. So does the registrar's handbook say something different? And it says 2, which has been the practice. So I'm just confused about what you're saying and then about what is written here.
Board Member Mueller-Aragon and members of the board, I may have to refer to Joyce Gormley on this one. Maybe we were unclear in our conversation.
Okay.
Or maybe we were referring to a different part of the policy.
Fine, Ms. Gormley, would you like to respond?
Yes, good evening, board members. I believe that Dr. Segura and I were discussing a different, we had talked about actually changing 4 semesters to 4 core semesters in elective in a different procedural directive in regards to students that enter from a non-accredited school. And so this policy, actually the recommendation is to align with the current practice that's in the course catalogs that states 2 consecutive semesters, not including summer school. So I apologize. We went over so many different procedural directives yesterday that you know, when they both talk about ranking, they both talk about senior year. One was specifically to students that came from non-accredited schools. And then this one is not necessarily for students coming from non-accredited schools.
Okay, so there will be that change. So there is that alignment then with the registrar's handbook. So that will be a change that is going to be made then, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
What is the change?
Board Member Dominguez just had a clarifying question. If you could summarize that change.
So I think the only change is going to be where it's going to just be aligned with the registrars, where it's just going to be changed, Member Dominguez, where it will say enrolled in an APS high school for 2 consecutive semesters, excluding summer school. So then it would align with the registrar's handbook. Is that when that's what you were referring to then?
So, Board Member Mueller-Aragon, Madam Chair, and members of the board, I think we would maintain number 4 in that we would keep it as the final 4 semesters for this particular section.
Okay.
So are we all clear on this one? And are there other questions or suggestions for this procedural directive? Right, I'm not seeing any, Ms. Reiser, so we can move on to the next procedural directive. Basis of offering credit.
Our next procedural directive is on page 62. And the change that was made to this is that bullet number 2 was updated to 1 credit with university or college credit with a 1-to-3 ratio. And so it was adjusted just a little bit. And if there's questions, it will stand for questions on that one.
Thank you. Any questions on this one? I am not seeing any, Ms. Reiser, so we can move on to the next procedural directive, alternative methods of earning credit.
Okay, this is on page 66 of your handouts. And nothing different than what your packet says. So that although there was one mistake, the number 3 and in the paragraph, the 3 were struck and those have been put back in. And that is on number 3 in the document. 3 and 3 were struck and they are now not struck.
So there's a couple of places where there's number 3. So what was the language change?
I just unstruck number 3. So Joyce, can you answer this one?
Struck and it shouldn't have been struck.
Okay.
Yes.
I believe board members, I believe she's referring to number 3 on page 66, where the number 3 in referring to 3 classes and have approval of. The student must enroll in an APS high school for at least 3 classes and have approval.
It was just mistakenly struck.
I see.
Thank you. We were just having a problem following where on the document. So that makes sense because otherwise the sentence would not have made sense.
So was I couldn't find it. I'm sorry.
Any other questions related to this procedural directive? Board Member Peterson.
So I'm going to ask a very elemental question that I should probably know the answer to. But as I look at this, am I reading it right that in short, as we look at increasing apprenticeship, internship kinds of opportunities, capstone projects, all of those things, as I look at sort of these 3 procedural directives, do these relate to those things in terms of how we determine credit and make sure that students are recognized for the work and learning that they are doing? Or does it have nothing to do with any of those things?
Board Member Peterson, Madam Chair, and members of the board. Yes, so when we look at alternative methods of earning credit, we're looking at things such as dual credit, work study, apprenticeships, mentorships, stuff like that. I think a lot of that discussion has taken place with our legislators and superintendents regarding opening up or thinking outside the box of how we can engage our kids more within our communities. And so, yes, that would be part of this.
Thank you.
I had another one, Madam Chair, that I just caught. So on page 67, under online courses, so it does say courses that APS Academy is a primary source for online coursework. And then it goes on to say courses from other institutions which are taken concurrently will not be posted to the student transcript without prior written approval from the school principal. So they will have to get approval from the school principal for them to be posted to the transcript. But even when they're posted to the transcript, if they got an A to an A, B, C, D, or F, that letter grade is not going to be posted to the transcript, even if they have approval to take the class. I'm understanding that correctly then? I mean, because it is an online, this is not talking about non-accredited. It is saying private online accredited institutions, but they're not going to get a letter grade posted to their transcript. I don't understand why not.
Board members, I believe the justification or the reasoning behind this, I think this was worked on back in June. And I believe at the time there was, sometimes we have families that will come at the beginning or middle of a school year and say, my student took this class from this online school, and now I want the honors credit and the I want it to advance him in math so that he can get into a higher math. And sometimes that disrupts what the schools can offer that student, and we can't guarantee the rigor or the instructional scope from even though it's an accredited unit school, it doesn't necessarily align to the same standards that our students are provided in our classes. So I think part of this was so that families have thoughtful conversations with their school counselors and administrators before enrolling their students in a private online course that may not be of the same level and rigor and provide the same instruction that they can get in their local school. And then I think it also helps equalize the playing field when it comes to providing honors or AP additional weighted credits. I think that was the intention of this.
Okay. And I mean, I just have a little bit of trouble with that because I know my daughter took an online class accredited, and, she did get, she was given a grade for it. So I just think there are some institutions, it just works better for some kids. And just to say you're not going to get a grade that you obviously earned and it's not going to get put on the transcript. I just don't find that to be fair, but that's just my opinion.
Great, thank you for that. So we will move on to procedural directive, awarding of credit or extra credit for non-academic activities. Ms. Reiser, you're muted.
This is on page 73 of your documents, and we have no additional changes to this, so we stand for questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the board? Great. There are no questions, so we will move on to the next agenda item, which is consideration for approval of revisions to board policy IJ, instructional resources and materials.
Okay, this is on page 75 of your documents. Policy IJ, instructional resources and materials, is brought for minor changes to content and updates to administrative and department positions. We made no additional changes. This is a discussion action item, and we stand for questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions from members of the board?
I have a comment and a suggested change.
Yes, Board Member Dominguez, go ahead.
In the second paragraph, students shall compensate the school district in case of lost, destroyed, unnecessarily damaged textbooks and or other instructional materials. This came up, let's see, a concern came up sometime when I was out and about talking to parents. Given our close to 4,000 homeless children, families, and our 54,000 students living in poverty, perhaps we could include language that is a little more forgiving, or takes that into account, or that acknowledges that many unfortunate happenings result in damaged materials through no fault of child or parent. Yeah, just some kind of language that I'm sure we already work with people, right? With families, just stating that. And that's,
So I think Superintendent Elder is leaning in to respond.
I think I'd like to hear from the board as a little bit of a whole, as kind of some language you'd suggest. I mean, the practice is that we work with families. We don't put them under tight deadlines. We don't, demand. In some cases, we've waived fees. Quite often we waive fees.
so maybe we work with families when unfortunate circumstances let's see, present themselves. Punto.
I think the language really is, I think, relates to state statute, that this is state materials, and that we are supposed to make an effort to, at least return some compensation.
Sure.
Maybe Board Member Jackson had a thought. I hear noises.
Well, yeah. Just because I was dealing with this in a different context over the end of the school year, there are, I believe, and Ms. Reiser, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that there is a procedural directive that actually addresses this, that gives the leeway to the schools. So with this being the policy, we don't necessarily need to address it in the policy, because I believe, and I'm trying to find it quickly,
You're correct.
there is a procedural directive.
This was we actually discussed this before. You're right. Thank you for reminding me. It is in the procedural directive that schools have the leeway to work with families, and they do. That's just the practice. Because
So it sounds like, sorry, well, I was just going to say, it sounds like from Board Member Jackson, am I hearing you suggest that we just reference that procedural directive and cut this sentence, students shall compensate?
Personally, I think it needs to stay. I mean, that's my personal opinion, is that the way it's written, fine. The procedural directives just need to be cross-referenced. I see one here, but I believe in the emails that I sent to a particular constituent, I attached like 2 more. I mean, there are copious amounts of procedural directives regarding this. So I think they just need to be added in that regards. And then I have something else when we get to that.
Okay,
So
I know Board Member Montoya Cordova has her hand up. So is this to respond to this issue as well?
Yes. So I'm thinking just on this particular paragraph, I think it would be easier if it started out in the event of lost, destroyed, or unnecessarily damaged textbooks and or other instructional materials, every effort is made to have students compensate the school district. Because I think if we start with what the issue is, rather than it just reads harsh, that students shall compensate, I think that's what's probably hanging us up a little bit. That's what hung me up a little bit. But I just say that I think if we started with what the issue is in the event of that, the students, every effort is made to assist students in compensating the district or something like that.
Thank you. So Board Member Dominguez, I see you nodding your head. Would that type of change respond to your
the
concern?
schools will make every effort to assist students. I like that, in compensating.
So Ms. Reiser and Dr. Albright, did you capture that change? Kind of.
Close. I believe that I have the majority of it, and we'll go back and listen to me. I have, in the event of lost and destroyed equipment, every effort will be made to assist students
In
compensate the school district. And then I need to take out lost, destroyed.
No, I think it should have been kept in there as well, as that in the case of lost, destroyed, or unnecessarily damaged. I think the sentence was okay. It's just switching it around and
Yeah,
just
move
putting okay, yeah,
But I need to take it out of the end and put it in the beginning.
right.
Thank you for that. And then I know Board Member Jackson, I think, wanted to take us in a different direction or had.
I did,
Is there anything else on that piece related to the compensation?
no, that's it.
Nope. Okay, go ahead, Board Member.
Okay, so this one kind of hits home for me and in the fact that it's for instructional resources and materials. And I'm struck by the sense that there's nothing in here about the requirement of teachers using approved materials. And so I wonder if there is a way that we can add required textbooks, under that first paragraph, add something like any teacher not implementing district approved curriculum or textbooks must seek to ensure alignment of their materials to New Mexico core content standards. Because I mean, this is, we buy these textbooks for a reason. We then issue them free to our students, and then our teenagers come home with books that are wrapped in duct tape.
Thank you.
Probably
Any
the
thoughts?
first- Probably just the first year. And I say that as a teacher who used an old textbook.
The book is from
because-
2005.
Okay.
You cannot tell me that it aligns with the New Mexico standards. And so I think that it's important that the instructional resources and materials that we use and that that there is a requirement that they are used and that we add this to the policy.
Thank you. I see Dr. Segura has her hand raised to respond.
Yes, Board Member Jackson, Madam Chair, and members of the board. That I think for the purpose of this policy, it's how we are as a district are providing the instructional resources and materials to students and how we manage those materials within our district. What you're referring to, I believe are in our other instructional policies that we're still reviewing and updating. But I will consider what you said as we move into revision of those policies.
So should this be, the title be shifted then, just to be more clarifying, is like the provision of instructional resources and materials?
I think that would be more appropriate.
Could you repeat that, please?
It was
I just changed the title of it to read the provision of instructional resources and materials.
Thank you.
And so then that clarifies that this policy is just about the provision, and we'll review a policy in the future related to how those resources are used in the classroom. Okay.
And TC, if you wanted to link it to the correct procedural directive, as Board Member Jackson, it's student fees, fines, and charges in section J. I texted it to you.
Thank you.
Appropriate number.
Great. Thank you, Board Member Jackson. I do agree with the importance of that. And I think it's really important that we keep that in front of us. It sounds like Dr. Segura agrees as well. So making sure that we have some processes in place to ensure that the money we're spending is put to use to ensure student learning. With that, are there any other questions on this one?
With the changes made, I will move for approval.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second, Yolanda.
Thank you. So Board Member Peterson made the initial motion and seconded by Board Member Montoya Cordova. The only change we're making is to the title
And the order of
and the order of that one sentence that we went around and around on.
And adding a procedural directive.
There were many changes with the proposed changes. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Yes.
Igimola Aragon,
Yes.
Barbara Peterson,
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez,
Yes.
Courtney Jackson.
Yes.
And Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes. So next up, we have several procedural directives related to this particular policy. So Ms. Reiser, I'll turn it over to you. It's selection of library, media, print, non-print material, library, media, disposition of outdated materials, and copyright compliance.
So the first one is on page 77. We have made no additional changes to that document that we are presenting. So if there are any questions.
Any questions on that one? Selection of library, media, print, non-print material. Okay, seeing none, we can go on to the next one.
The next one is on page 80, and we have made no additional changes to that document.
Thank you. Any suggestions or questions related to library, media, disposition of outdated materials? All right, none on that one. So we can move to the next, which is copyright compliance.
And the next one is on page 83, and we've made no additional changes to that one either.
Great, thank you. Any additional questions or comments on procedural directive for copyright compliance? All right, thank you. Then we will move on to agenda item under special issues K, consideration for approval of revisions to board policy IJ1, student travel, field and activity trips.
Okay, this is on page 89 of your documents. Policy IJ1, student travel, field and activity trips is brought for minor changes to content, updates to administrative and department positions and references. And in addition to Dr. Segura, I believe we have Dr. Blakey to assist with any questions on this document.
Great, thank you. Any questions on this one, IJ1 student travel?
I'll move for approval.
Thank you. We have a motion for approval from Board Member Peterson. Is there a second?
I'll second.
We have a second from Board Member Muller-Aragon. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Yes.
Muller-Aragon,
Yes.
Barbara Peterson,
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez,
Yes.
Courtney Jackson,
Yes.
and Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes. So next up, we have a related procedural directive on student insurance.
Okay, this item is on page 92 of your documents, and we have made no additional changes to this document either.
Thank you, Ms. Reiser. Any questions or comments from the board on this procedural directive?
Is this to cover the Cancun senior trips?
No, ma'am, we do not allow Cancun senior trips. You just approved that.
But only in quotes. We don't allow senior
We
trips.
don't allow senior trips. We are not participating
Can I make it?
anyway.
All right. I don't think there are questions. Oh,
No,
Board
but
Member
I-
Tapia Romero, were you raising your hand? I'm sorry. You were.
No, I was saying I'd chaperone.
Thank you. So
I
we-
think actually Board Member Tapia Romero can actually coordinate them too.
Probably.
As well as assume all liability. Thank you very much.
Thanks. All right, thank you. We will move on to special item I, consideration for approval of revisions, including renaming of board policy I09, teaching about controversial or sensitive issues, to IM, teaching about controversial or sensitive issues.
And this item is on page 94 of your documents, and we have made no additional changes. It does have some changes to a title. It has a title update, minor changes to content and administrative and department positions and references. And with that, we stand for any questions. This is a discussion action item.
You, any questions on this one?
I'll move for approval.
I second.
Thank you. We have a motion from
Yeah.
Board Member Peterson and a second from Board Member Dominguez to approve this one. Dr. Albright, can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yolanda Montoya Cordova,
Yes.
Iggy Muller-Aragon,
Yes.
Barbara Peterson,
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez,
Yes.
Courtney Jackson,
Yes.
and Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes, and next up is a related procedural directives, controversial issues and outside speakers.
This is on page 96 of your documents, and we have made no additional changes to what you have in your packet. We stand for questions.
Board Member Muller-Aragon.
So on the, I think number 4, it says that teachers must inform and get written approval from their principals. And I get that part. So my question is, there have to be also approval from the parents, or the parents have to be told about who the speaker is. Is that correct? Like ahead of time?
Board Member Mueller Aragon, Madam Chair and members of the board. Yes, so it is always in good practice to anytime you're going to bring any guest into a classroom, that parents are made aware of that guest speaker. So that if it's something that they don't agree with as far as a topic or the individual, that their student can be provided with an alternative engagement. So.
Right, and I saw that in number 2, if there was, a matter of principle that they would be able to receive an alternative activity. But my question, just because I have had, parents tell me that they heard about the speaker after the fact and they didn't approve of it, but it was too late. So then my question is, if they're told about a guest speaker, are they also told what that guest speaker is going to be speaking about? Is that like on a form somewhere where the parents will know?
Board Member Mueller Aragon, Madam Chair, members of the board. I am not sure that we have a district-wide form for that. I know schools have individual forms regarding, like, for example, if a guest speaker or a movie that's going to be shown in classroom, they'll send that permission form home to inform and get permission from the parent and or guardian. So we can definitely add something in here if that's something we want to do, and we can work on that so that principals know that should be the expectation in the schools.
Right, because I know whenever you're going to show a film, if it's going to be R-rated or PG or whatever, that you have to send that out so the parents know and they know exactly what's going on. But as it concerns outside speakers, I've heard too many times parents just had no idea what the speaker was going to be speaking about. So I've just heard it too many times as a concern. So if you could add something like that so that principals do know, they need to let them know ahead of time about the speaker and also what the speaker is going to be speaking about. I think that will allay a lot of parents' concerns about hearing something after the fact. It's hard to, say I don't agree with something in principle and it already happened and then it's too late because you can't unhear what a speaker said. So if we could do this and be proactive, I'd appreciate it.
So in the section called students on number 2, we could just add a clause to the front of that sentence. Parents and students should be notified of potential controversial issues and outside speakers and proposed content in advance, period, if it is established that a student or a parent, et cetera. But generally, then I would also make parent/guardian wherever parent shows up throughout. Does that work for you, Board Member Mueller? Then, yes. And so then that would be what you can take to cabinet for discussion. Are there other suggestions or questions on this one?
I just want to point out that I did submit some corrections. Like in item number 3 under parents, to the accomplishment of the district goals, just to accomplish the district goals and those sorts of, but I will say number 5 is unruly. It just needs, my suggestion is subject, transitive verb, direct object, get out of there.
So considering that we're trying to stay out of the typographical and grammar editing, we'll offer that suggestion. You've also emailed it in advance. We'll trust that that will be considered as well.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. I think we're ready to move on to the next procedural directive, which is human sexuality and HIV/AIDS instruction.
This document is on page 99 of your handouts, and we have no additional changes from the document in front of you. With that, we'll stand for questions.
It's great. Thank you. Board members, are there any questions or comments on this one?
I definitely do.
All right, board member Milano.
So, I know I had said, and the response I received from you all, that the language in the code was just causing some confusion, is what you had said. But when you're looking here, you did tell me that the HIV and AIDS, wording, it still stands in here, but yet for our elementary students, and it says all students in the elementary grades. But that's not what I was told was being taught, that wasn't being taught until 5th grade, which is what I remember when I was teaching. But when you look at it, it still says that even though you all told me it's not being taught at kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, it still says provide HIV/AIDS instruction in the curriculum content area to all students in the elementary grades. And so if it's not mandated to all students, then shouldn't that wording be fixed?
Member Mueller Aragon, Allison Posha was going to try to join us tonight to discuss this procedural directive, but she is actually traveling and unable to log on. So I will take your feedback back to her, as this is a procedural directive, for more review.
Thank you. Did you have anything else, board member Muller-Aragon?
No, I just was hoping that it's really the first paragraph that has to just get fixed. If we aren't teaching that to kindergarten to 4th graders, then that wording has to get changed.
Great.
So, yep, if you could just take it, that'd be great.
Board member Montoya Cordova.
I was just going to offer a friendly amendment to that statement then, is just, how about it's just the curriculum of the required health education content area to students in alignment with the New Mexico Administrative Code, so that we don't tie ourselves to what grades it is, but it's just in alignment to that.
Yeah,
Thank you for that. I'm seeing nodding
However
and
they would-
shaking in
yeah.
agreement. So we'll offer up that suggestion for you and the team to discuss, as this is a procedural directive. All right, I think we are ready to move on to, oh, no more procedural directives on this one. Sorry. Parental concerns about instructional materials.
Next up, this is on page 103 of your handouts, and it was suggested, let's see, that the first sentence, let's see, changes. The first line of this procedural directive is being deleted and the paragraph updated. Concerns, so I'm trying to find that first. Concerns for me. Joyce, can you speak to this one? Because I'm trying to find the change.
Is Ms. Gormley still available? You have the
I
floor.
am, but I apologize, TC, I did not work on this procedural directive, so I don't have the amendments to that paragraph.
It is the, okay, so what is being changed is the line that says it is difficult to legally remove materials once they've been placed into the library collection. And I don't see that.
I think that's in a different section. I believe that's a little bit
Later.
I think that's in.
Am I looking at the wrong procedural directive? I may have put this in the wrong place. So what's in front of you is, do you have any questions about the one in front of you?
I do. I have a question. Sorry.
Okay.
So I'm yeah, this was the right one. So I guess I have an overall procedural question. There's a lot of 15 days and then another 5 days and then all of these things. And then we put together a committee. So I guess going back to the very beginning, what happens to the document or the item of concern while this entire process is we're going through this entire process. Like if there is something that is of legitimate concern, is it removed until we've gone through this process, or is it retained until we go through this process?
I believe it's retained until we go through the process.
Mhm.
I will have to verify that with Ms. Altabelli.
Okay. Why?
I believe because it's a currently approved material and you have a concern that's been raised. But at that moment, it's already been placed in the collection.
Okay.
I'll have to verify that with Ms. Altabelli.
Yeah, I'm
I
I'm
don't have-
curious about that. Like there's this entire process, but there's this lingering, but if there is a concern about the document, we don't actually know what happens during the process for the document. So I would be interested to know.
Certainly something we can get back to you on.
Board Member Peterson.
It-
Never remember.
Going back to the selection process, it's already been approved. It's already been through a process, which is why it's in the collection in the first place. And so there's a reason why it's there. If someone finds it objectionable, then on what basis is it objectionable? And do you deprive students of access to material based on one parent's concern when it's already been through the process to be in the collection?
Like I said, I'm simply telling what I believe to be true, that I definitely will need to speak to Ms. Altabelli to get the actual process. I understand what you're asking, but I do believe because it's already been placed in the collection, it stays in the collection until the process is done.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from Ms. Antabelli and it's just a curiosity that I have. And so I'd like to know the answer.
Very good.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. We will follow up on that one. Other questions related to parental concerns about instructional materials?
I mean, the only thing I would kind of go with what Member Jackson was saying, because that was like kind of my concern, because it does say it's legally difficult to remove materials once they're already placed into the collection. So it's difficult to do. But then it says parents are able to have those media materials considered. So I think there has to be some kind of like clarification. I understand once it's in there, you have to go through this whole process. So what you want to make sure is before it's housed in the library that you've done everything that needed to be done, because once it's there, it's obviously difficult to have it removed. And so I think that just somehow needs to be clarified, because it makes it seem like, okay, parents might object to something, but it's almost going to be almost impossible legally to get the stuff removed, but yet you're telling parents that they can be reconsidered. So I just think you all have to look at it and just make it just more clear.
So it sounds like they will do that. I had one question, which is, so the title of this is Parental Concerns about Instructional Materials, but it reads that it's largely about parental concerns about library media materials, not instructional materials, which is more a catch-all for textbooks, curriculum, technology, et cetera. So my question or suggestion is, should we change the title, or should we add and clarify around instructional materials as well? And I will say, based on my experience with my kids, and when I had concerns about the instructional materials, it wasn't because of anything controversial in the library. It was because the content was way too low for my kids. So if my teacher is giving my sixth grader third grade content that is an approved textbook, what do I do as a parent? So is that something that would fall under this, or is there some other recourse for parents around that?
I believe the recourse would, again, it's an interesting question. I don't believe it's a concern about the material necessarily. It's the actual practice of the teacher's decision to provide that child. So to me, it's more of a matter to be discussed with the school authority and in terms of a change of practice. Well, I understand that things don't always work out to everyone's satisfaction. I understand your story. I'm just saying I don't believe it's actual a procedural directive, I think, because I don't believe it doesn't relate to the material, it relates to the practice of how it was applied. I understand your point.
Yeah, so I guess, so the question is, does this need to be parental concerns about library media or something rather than instructional materials, which within education terminology does have a broader connotation, is sort of the first question. The second is, maybe this comes in later procedural directives, Dr. Segura, but what can parents do when they have concerns about the quality of content and questionable alignment to standards? So those are both just suggestions and questions. I know it's a procedural directive, so we don't have to vote. So those are offered up for your consideration in cabinet. Any other questions or comments on this one? Okay.
I think that's a good clarification, definitely.
Thank you. We will move forward to criteria for use of video and other instructional audio-visual media.
This item is on page 106.
Sorry, Ms. Reiser. So I just wanted to, you mentioned the language is difficult to legally remove, which is up on page 77 in selection of library media, print, non-print, which we already went through. So I just wanted to mention that when I did a control find. I don't know if there's reason to go back to there, if there was comment you wanted to make on that before we keep moving to criteria for use of video.
I believe Ms. Altobelli has recommended a change in some language, but I'm not sure at this point which procedural directive it's in. So she is working on both of those based on the feedback we received through the questions.
Okay, so there may be additional suggested changes to selection of library media, print, non-print material, which was considered earlier in the agenda.
Yes.
So I was sorry to interrupt you, but I didn't want to lose that thread. So go ahead with criteria.
Yes. Okay, so the next one is use of videos and films. That's on page 106 of your documents, and there are no additional changes to that document. So we'll stand for questions.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we can keep the procedural directive animals in school, including service animals.
So this is on page 106 of, I'm sorry, this is on page 111 of your documents, and there are no additional changes in this document.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the board on animals in school?
It makes me sad. One of the best days that I ever had in first grade was the day we brought our dogs. It was a good day, and there was a lot of learning that went along with it. Luckily, there were no bites.
Plus, there are multiple children's books about kids going to school. We have Biscuit Goes to School. If there are no comments on this one, we can continue to move ahead to the next procedural directive, exemptions from health or physical education.
This document is on page 115 of your electronic documents, and there are no additional changes, so we will stand for questions.
Thank you. Board members, any questions?
I just, this one, I know, I'm just concerned about, wait, I have to step back. I'm sorry, I'm not ready. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So I think there are no questions on this one, and we'll move to the procedural directive on flag display and Pledge of Allegiance. So Ms. Reiser, you can go ahead and take that one.
Yes, flag display and Pledge of Allegiance is on page 120 of your handouts, and we have no additional changes to this document.
Thank you. Questions from the board?
If we could just have a reminder, Superintendent Elder, to all the schools. I don't want to call out certain teachers or schools that don't have children recite the pledge if they so wish. So if you could just send out a reminder to everyone, because I'm not going to call people out.
You can do that.
Thank you.
To do what?
To remind them about the regulations around in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Which are
Stated here.
It has to be said, but no one shall be coerced into participation.
You have to provide the opportunity for the Pledge of Allegiance to be said every day at school.
okay.
That they can abstain.
Great, thank you. We will move to the next procedural directive, evening high school.
So evening high school is on page 122 of your handouts, and we are looking to repeal and archive this procedural directive. The
Yeah.
content no longer aligns with our district practices.
Great, so
Any
I
more questions?
can move through that one and go on to the next one, reasonable restraint and seclusion.
Okay, reasonable restraint and seclusion is on page 124 of your handouts. This procedural directive is brought for updates to content which align to the PED guidance and updates to law, administrative and department positions and references. I did fix the first bullet in the lower section to read prone restraint in which a student is held face down on the floor, wall, or another surface in a restraint technique which impedes the ability to breathe or speak is not allowed. And this language is directly from the PED guidance. So it's almost exactly word for word from PED guidance. With that, we'll stand for questions. Oh, I'm sorry, there is one additional change, and that the Executive Director of Accountability and Reporting is added as a department position for this.
Thank you. Board members, any questions or comments on this one? Board Member Peterson.
So, I mean, I think the language is absolutely essential, and severe limitations. The one thing that crosses my mind, and this may not even belong in the procedural directive, but this is when a child needs to be restrained, it is a traumatic experience frequently for everyone involved, staff as well as the child. And so in practice, whether it's in the procedural directive or not, one of the things that comes up, I think just because of how short-staffed available personnel is in schools so frequently, then there's also never time, or frequently there's not time for going back and reviewing what happened, how it happened, what could have been done differently. And I think that lets us not move forward in as positive a way, either for the health and safety of staff or the health and safety of students. And I think some kind of recognition of when a child reaches that point of needing to be restrained, there are all sorts of things that have led up to it and that continue afterwards. And to be really intentional about supporting staff, supporting students, I think is real essential. I don't have any specific language, but I think it's something that we really need to address.
Thank you, Board Member Peterson. So there is the added bullet in documentation and reporting related to reintegration. So I think it is adding the concept of reintegration up above into the techniques section would be the suggestion.
But reviewing what led up to the incident is what, I mean, give a complete.
Which is what reintegration includes.
Yeah.
Part of the process is to look for the triggers. It's part of the process of when we sit down and review the situation, what triggered it, so that we can try to remove those triggers if possible in the future. So it is a part of the process.
Thank you, Board Member Montoya Cordova.
And for me, it's just at the last section of it where it's like the annual review, the school shall conduct that. I think the only thing that's missing for me is that, and then what? So an annual review and then what? Is there, we do the analysis and all this, but is there anything that sort of compiles that at the district level so that we look for trends or we look for and understand like where there might be some difficulties. So it just kind of fell short for me on the annual review piece, because I think it's at the school level, it's important, but it doesn't state anything about action or what they do with that annual review.
Board member Montoya Cordova, Madam Chair and members of the board. I know that the way that it is collected happens differently in different districts. And so I will refer to our associate superintendent for special education, even though this can also take place outside of special education, and we realize that as well. So if there she is, Sinitra.
Good evening, members of the board. So the new guidance and the update does follow the PED memo that we received in July of 2021, which recommends that we review annually all instances of restraint and seclusion for all students at the school level. Really looking at reviewing the information and looking at how we're supporting students, how additional training that's needed. We do provide the nonviolent crisis intervention training. It's offered to all schools that really looks at de-escalation and ways to support students in maintaining their behavior management strategies, and ways to create a culture of safety. Also integrating restorative practices and SEL into our schools to really help create that spectrum of intentional relationships with our students, and looking at reintegration back into the schools and into the classrooms.
And I understand that. I guess where it's still just falling short for me is that I know that that's done at a school site or a school level, right? And this annual review of all the incidences. So I'm wondering is like, how does the district utilize that information to sort of identify trends or to identify challenges, or places that maybe additional technical assistance is needed? So I just didn't understand that part. To me, it says like it's good to do an annual review, but I didn't understand to what end. Like how does that review get sort of rolled up into understanding, as a district, and our seclusion procedural directives, are they being followed with fidelity? Is there places for that? So while I trust the school level to do this piece, I just think as a district level, as the part to provide the ongoing TA or assistance on that, I think it's important to look at it also collectively, so that we could just make sure that we can identify if there's, if there are incidences that seem, that rise, or there's gaps, or there's also opportunities. Maybe there are places where there's best practices and things that did go well, but I was just curious about that. I mean, it's like an annual review is a good thing, but, and then what?
Yes, and Board President Yolanda Cordova, we are looking at ways to systemize our process, since it's something that's a new requirement from PED, and we received that memo at the end of July. We're working to do a better job at really creating those processes to best support students, and working across departments to provide those systems of support for all students.
And Board Member Montoya Cordova and all members of the board, I really want to emphasize something. When we talk about this, let's talk about restraint. We don't utilize seclusion. And the only reason the language is still here is it's in the statute and it's in the PED guidance. But I really want to be clear. We've eliminated seclusion rooms. We do not utilize that technique any longer. So we're not talking about restraint and seclusion. We're really just talking about restraint.
So Superintendent Elder, you hit on what was going to be my question, is if we aren't using seclusion, it seems we should say that.
I agree. What I believe, what I was advised by legal is that this language really follows the language of the law and really follows the guidance. I'm certainly willing to reconsider that because we don't practice seclusion, and I just think that's an important point to be made.
I agree that it's important. And so I think while we can keep much of the technical language that follows from the statute, the intro paragraph, which I think is our statement of values from this board. Albuquerque Public Schools is committed to providing safe environments for all students. Crisis intervention techniques are intended to, et cetera. We can insert a sentence there or take out the seclusion and say clearly directly, it is the policy of the Albuquerque Public Schools to not use seclusion as a de-escalation technique.
Which means we get rid of and or seclusion, right?
I have asked our legal team to jump on because we, in reviewing this policy or this procedural directive with legal, it was the recommendation that we directly follow the PED guidance for this procedural directive. So I've texted her to see if she can jump in, but that was the legal guidance that we received, was to follow the PED guidance exactly.
So that's, I think perhaps then when we consider the related policy, we ought to be clear that as a matter of values, we don't use seclusion.
I appreciate that. I'm telling you, I brought this is, you and I are in lockstep on this one, so I will continue to pursue that. Oh, like the attorneys here, I apologize.
That's okay. Hi, I'm Mia. I don't think I've had to jump on yet, and I am one of the legal counsel for APS. And I did take a look at the memo from PED and then what this procedural directive was going to say. And it was my advice, and in consulting with the rest of the team that I work with, that we mirror the language that is in the PED guidance. I understand that, we have gotten rid of the quote unquote seclusion rooms, but the way that the term is used within the PED memo, again, the guidance was that we keep both of those in there for the procedural directive. And so we can have a further discussion about that, and I can provide some additional insight if needed.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I do think that as legal guidance makes sense for the procedural directive, and it is worth considering what our policy says about seclusion and restraint. And so I think with this one, there was just the suggestion from board member Montoya Cordova that you beef up the annual review section to say what happens with that, so that maybe the report is presented to the superintendent and targeted technical assistance and support is provided or something like that. Other questions on this one? Oh, come on, guys. You don't want to finish, do you?
Number 8.
All right. With that, then, that concludes our discussion and our policy committee meeting. So the next policy committee meeting will be held in February at 5 p.m. in the John Milne Community Boardroom of the Alice and Bruce King Educational Complex. And this meeting is adjourned.